Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Vesta, and I'm at the UC Berkeley School of Law, Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy. And I want to welcome you to our inaugural Berkeley Food Institute Symposium. Yeah. I've been a member of the executive committee for the last 6 months working on planning this, and I can't tell you how excited we are to have you here. We are really energized by the diversity of interest, perspectives, and are really looking forward to a rich discussion. As you'll see in the program, we want to have a dialogue. Our goal is to really learn from each other, that to help shape the Institute's research and program agenda in the coming years. I was just talking to someone, and I feel it necessary to reiterate. If there is one fundamental goal of this Institute, is to really make progress on breaking down the silos. We hear about it all the time, but the urgency of our challenges are such that we have silos in the academic community. We have silos between the academic world and the community. In the communities, we have silos among different parts of the food system. Our goal is to have a discussion that can connect research, policy, practice, and social movements that we believe is going to be necessary to change the food system to one that is resilient and sustainable for the future. We, being at the university, feel strongly that research and education can be a very important part of the need to provide what's needed to change our food system. But we also recognize that no single discipline, institution, or group can solve the problems that are facing us by itself. That's why we've gathered you here today. Now, I have been involved in enough meetings to know one thing. There are people outside of this room that should be here. There are people who couldn't be, or maybe we didn't even know of. And what I want to stress is that this is a beginning. The challenges are such is that we will need more and more of these conversations. So don't feel like because we didn't think of X, that we're completely blinded to the need to bring in other voices. It's a first step. But one of the really exciting things that I've had to do is the participation of really talented people. And we have two key faculty leaders, Professors Claire Kremen and Alistair Isles, both of whom are interdisciplinary scholars and faculty members in the College of Natural Resources. And I can tell you that without their extraordinary commitment of time, energy, intellectual energy, and personal passion, we would not be here. So Claire and Alistair, I'm going to ask you to please stand up so that people... Now, a few housekeeping details. You know this, but I'm going to say it again. Turn off your cell phone or silence your cell phone. As someone who has been guilty of being in a very important meeting when the phone went off, it is hugely embarrassing. Now, bathrooms are located outside to my right. We will have lunch in the courtyard, a delicious vegetarian lunch. We want you to take advantage of our beautiful location and eat outside when we break for lunch, and because we are blessed with fantastic weather. Now, we will be giving you further instructions on the rest of the day's program after our keynote. You've got the program, and I hope that you, by reviewing who will be on the panels and how the discussion is set up, that you will agree with me that this is going to be a really exciting day. But to start us off, I can't tell you how fortunate we are to have and to welcome Olivier De Schutter the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, as our keynote speaker. Olivier will help set the stage for our conversations and what we hope, and we dearly expect to be, an actionable agenda. Before I welcome him to the podium, I want to tell you a little bit about him. He received his LLM from Harvard and his PhD in law from the University of Louvain in Belgium. He is currently a professor at the Catholic University of Louvain and at the College of Europe. He is a member of the Global Law School faculty at NYU and a visiting professor at Columbia University. I'm also very proud to report that Berkeley will benefit by his coming as a visiting scholar, supported by the Food Institute, to Berkeley this coming fall. We're very excited about his joining us. From 2002 until 2006, Mr. De Schutter chaired the EU network of independent experts on fundamental rights, a high-level group of experts that advise the EU institutions on fundamental rights issues. Since 2004, and until his appointment as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, he has been the General Secretary of the International Federation of Human Rights on the issue of globalization and human rights. So he is an influential scholar in the fields of governance and human rights, social and economic rights, trade and investment law. Someone who epitomizes the need to be involved in all these various sectors. He is a prolific writer, helping to engage a broader audience and inform, educate, and shape our collective response to these very challenging issues. We really are honored to start off our discussion today with Olivier De Schutter. Please help me welcome him.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends, let me first of all thank you, Maria, for these very kind words of introduction. And let me thank, first of all, Caroline Federman for having made it possible to have this event today. One way I'd like to thank her is by showing one of the many emails that she sent me. This one from the 1st of May, which brings us right at the center stage of this discussion. There is an option to have the podium on the floor in front of the conference attendees rather than on the stage. This creates a more intimate setting. However, I might be turning my back then to the screen, so maybe a bit on the side, on the left perhaps, and that is the kind of detail and professionalism in which Caroline went. So thank you very much. And she probably does not need to stand up because everybody knows her. She must be somewhere in the room. Okay, so, right. So, thank you so much also to, of course, Claire Kuhlman and Alistair Isles for their work in establishing this institute, and to my dear friend Raj Patel for having involved me in this new venture. Now, if we speak of sustainable food systems, we first have to ask what we mean by this. And we have some definitions that are available that are being debated at international or sometimes less international levels. And I'd like to show you two of these definitions which seem to me particularly useful. The first one is developed by a symposium of experts convened at the FAO in 2010, who defined sustainable diets as diets with low environmental impacts which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair, and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe, and healthy, while optimizing natural and human resources. And to a certain extent, the definition of sustainable food and agricultural systems of the Sustainable Food Laboratory in Vermont replicates this earlier definition. So sustainability, according to these definitions, would include environmental dimensions related to the health of the soil, greenhouse gas emissions, agrobiodiversity, preservation of water sources, social dimensions, and health or nutrition dimensions. And in this regard, it is indeed excellent and important that various colleges, departments are joining efforts in order to build this new institute at Berkeley, the College of Natural Resources, Berkeley Law, the Graduate School of Journalism, and of course, the Goldman School of Public Policy, represented here by Dean Henry Brady. And I understand that the School of Public Health is also contributing to establishing this institute in a truly interdisciplinary spirit. Now, this definition of sustainability and these three dimensions of the environment, the social, and the health nutrition dimension shows how complex the task is. And let me say just a few words on each of these challenges to show that these are concerns that are global and extremely urgent, and show why they can be, in fact, an opportunity. Consider first the ecological limits and the environmental sustainability concerns that are raised by the current food systems. In this study by Rockström and collaborators published in Nature in 2009, they identified what boundaries we were crossing, moving beyond the ecological limits that the Earth imposed on us. The green part here is the part where we are in a safe space. Once we move beyond the green area, we are crossing a threshold. And there are three domains that could be documented by Rockström and others where thresholds have been crossed already. The first one is the loss of agrobiodiversity, genetic diversity erosion, that is the result of monocropping. We are losing today more than 100 per million species every year when the threshold of sustainability is considered to be at 10. And this is an issue I know that is very dear to the work of Claire Cremen in particular. We also are crossing another threshold, which is the nitrogen cycle. It would be safe to extract from the atmosphere about 35 million tons of nitrogen per year. We are today extracting 121 million tons of nitrogen from the atmosphere. In addition, this creates huge problems of pollution, nitrogen runoff resulting in eutrophication in the oceans, and so forth. A third limit that we have crossed is that of climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions have continued to increase, and we have just passed, actually a couple of days ago, the symbolic mark of 400 parts per million of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, breaking a record that had not been broken for billions of years, when we were roughly at a stable level of 270, 280 parts per million, the pre-industrial level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And there are other concerns, of course, of ecological nature, the pollution of soil and water, land degradation in particular. So we are crossing these boundaries, and that is a first challenge that sustainable food systems should address. A second challenge is social equity. As symbolized by the work of the coalition of Immokalee workers, the tomato pickers in Florida, the wages in the food systems are generally extremely low, and the farm gate price that the farmers receive for their produce is extremely low, despite the fact that the price is often too high for poor consumers unable to afford adequate diets. In fact, this is not proper to industrial systems. In the world, it is estimated that about 70, perhaps 80% of those who are hungry are small-scale food producers. They are small-scale farmers. They are landless workers working on a seasonal basis, often on large farms, Or there are artisanal fishers, small herders, forest dwellers who depend on the forest for hunting, fishing, gathering fruit, and so forth. And altogether, it is estimated that maybe 80% of the 870 million people who are hungry are themselves small-scale food producers. So that is a second major challenge, is how to make the system more equitable for those who help to maintain it. A third challenge is that of the health and nutrition dimensions. And here, it is clear that the health impacts of our current ways of producing and consuming food are simply not sustainable. And this is for two reasons. First, since the Malthusian fears of the 1960s and 1970s, the emphasis has been on increasing calorie availability and focusing on major cereals, rice, wheat, maize in particular, soybean also to a certain extent. And this was done without any regard for the nutritional dimensions and for the links between agriculture, food, and health impacts. Secondly, urbanization and the associated lifestyle changes have led to nutrition transition taking place in a range of countries, people shifting to more processed foods, shifting to foods that are prepared in industrial food chains, and as a result, developing new diseases that until recently were a privilege of rich countries. And the result is the two burdens that sometimes countries are coming to face concurrently. First, micronutrient deficiency. People, even though enough fed, suffer from vitamin A deficiency, zinc deficiency, iron deficiency, for example. There are 2 billion people today who suffer from anemia in the developing world. And the second burden is, of course, as illustrated by this graph here, overweight and obesity, with 1.4 billion people on Earth who are either overweight, 1 billion, or obese, beyond 300 million, perhaps up to 400 million people with a bodily mass index above 30. This results in 2.8 million premature deaths on an annual basis globally, people dying from heart disease, from type 2 diabetes, from some forms of cancers that are linked to inadequate diets. And this has, of course, a huge impact on healthcare costs. In fact, just a month ago, the American Diabetes Association came up with figures showing that between 2007 and 2012, the cost of treating diabetes in the US had increased by 41%. We are now at about $245 billion US dedicated to treating patients with type 2 diabetes. Now, these various crises are in fact systemic. They are systemic in two ways. First, because all these crises, all these impacts, can be traced to the main emphasis being placed on the production of cheap calories for a low-cost food system characterized by artificially low costs of production. As a substitute for redistributive social policies that would protect the poor from high prices, we have dumped cheap foods on markets at the expense of longer-term sustainability concerns. The crisis is systemic in another way, and that is that these different impacts, environmental, social, and health impacts, are of concern to different constituencies who often have not been working together but now are forming new and exciting coalitions. Environmental sustainability, calling for agroecological, low-input types of farming, is of concern, of course, to environmental NGOs and to increasingly large numbers of concerned scientists. Social equity, that call for fair wages, that call for the enforcement of labor laws, that call for improved governance of food chains, call for strengthening the bargaining power of farmers vis-à-vis commodity buyers, this is of concern to farm workers' unions and to farmers' unions and organizations. And thirdly, the health impacts, calling for social policies to allow people to afford better diets and not to have to depend on junk food for their subsistence, is of concern to healthcare practitioners and to politicians concerned about healthcare budgets, as well as consumers. So I see an opportunity in this systemic nature of the crisis. New alliances can be built, and new alliances to make a difference. The question to us, and the question to many who will be working with the Institute, will be, however, not what must be done, on which there is today a broad consensus emerging, but how must we achieve such a transition? And here, I would like to refer to one dominant view, which is what might be called the Dutch school view. This is not an allusion to Van Dyck or Rembrandt, but it's an allusion to one multi-level perspective that is adopted to describe the necessary transitions in the food systems. And this is a perspective developed by some Dutch scholars, including Johan Scott from Eindhoven and Twente universities, Frank Gales, who is now chair of the International Sustainability Transition Research Network in Manchester University, formerly Sussex University, but he is a Dutch also, and John Grin, who is teaching political science at the University of Amsterdam. And what they propose is to distinguish 3 levels to understand transitions. One level is the broad trends, what they call landscape trends, that are exogenous, that are long-term, that we hardly can influence because they depend on factors that we can hardly change at all. For example, globalization or the emergence of a discourse on sustainable development. A second level is that of the regimes, the socio-technical, socio-cultural, socio-economic regimes that together form a dominant model with a very strong stability due to the co-evolution of different elements that are mutually supportive to establish this mainstream dominant regime. And this regime, this intermediate level, is characterized by a very strong path dependency, past choices determining future possibilities, because certain technical solutions are paired with economic organization and value and norm systems, mutually reinforcing each other in shaping such a dominant regime. This is not to say that the regime can never be changed. Indeed, actors may influence the regime by understanding that the dominance of the past over the future may be broken by understanding where we come from and why the path that is being followed is not sustainable. And normative concerns, values, can change as actors discover the unsustainability of the path that they are espousing and seek to change their behavior to build a new regime. But these revolutions, to speak in Kuhnian terms, happen very slowly, with great difficulties, and often only as a result of major crisis. And then finally, we have a third level, that of niche innovations, experiments in innovative practices that sometimes will influence changes in the regime itself. Now, this multi-level perspective approach is one that is, to a certain extent, useful in identifying the obstacles to transition. And let me take the example which I think best illustrates this, and which is related to the work I've been doing with others on agroecology. And I'd like to salute here the presence of Miguel Altieri from Berkeley University, but also Eric Hall Jimenez from Food First, and Steve Gleesman from University of California in Santa Cruz, who are pioneers in thinking about agroecology and on whose work I based my own reports to the UN on agroecology. And what did I find? I found that there were many obstacles to agroecology penetrating the dominant systems and really being a substitute, seen as a substitute by policymakers to the dominant ways of producing food. And the reasons are a series of lock-ins, a series of blockages that can be analyzed in a regime's perspective as linked to the socio-technical, socio-cultural, and socio-economic dimensions of the dominant regime. For example, agroecology is not compatible with the way agri-food companies work. They need large volumes of uniform things, and they find it very difficult to source their produce, their supplies, from farmers practicing agroecological techniques. The social-cultural aspects are not to be underestimated. In my discussions with governments, I found that very often they had this view of modernization as being monolinear. All modernization should be more industrialization, and any step towards reconstituting natural processes would be a step backwards instead of a move forward. There is also a very strong disbelief of technocratic elites in the potential of agroecology as a different way of producing food. And then there are socio-economic aspects that are important. It's clear that agroecology means reducing the dependency of food producers on external inputs and on technology providers. And this is not in the interest of a large range of vested interests. And agroecology is not compatible with the way we undervalue our resources and the way we insist on improving labor productivity rather than total factor productivity or resource efficiency in calculating the benefits of different ways of producing food. And this, I think, is very remarkably demonstrated by the book, The Value of Nothing, of Raj Patel. Now, in that sense, the multi-level perspective, the Dutch school approach to transitions, is one that is useful, because although it's relatively banal to list these different obstacles to change, it helps us at least draw this catalog, if you wish, and identify the blockages like I've tried to illustrate for agroecology. However, I believe that the multi-level perspective is also very limited in a number of ways. First of all, there is a big ambiguity about the landscape, right? The background against which transitions must, if at all, occur. Sometimes the landscape is seen as exogenous, as beyond our ability to reach it and change it. And sometimes it's simply strongly institutionalized practices that are particularly strong and inert, but not necessarily impossible to change. But more importantly, I think the status of niche innovations is very problematic, because these niche innovations are bound either to fail and to be condemned to oblivion, or to be co-opted in the dominant regime, which can transform itself by absorbing these technical innovations. So, if you wish, the best that niche innovations can hope for is to be absorbed, co-opted by the dominant regime. And in that sense, I think the multi-level perspective approach is developed based on the idea that innovations are technical in nature, that can incrementally improve the dominant regimes, rather than constituting real alternatives to the dominant regimes, and rather than emphasizing the empowerment and autonomy dimensions of social innovations rather than technical innovations or technical fixes. It is my view that under the multi-level perspective approach, niche innovations, which will be nurtured until the system is ripe to welcome them in the mainstream, if you wish, are not, in fact, as subversive as if we conceive them in a much quite different perspective, in a social diversity approach that is based on citizens-led alternatives to new food systems. And what I would suggest is that for niche innovations, in the multi-level perspective, to have a chance of transforming the regime, there is a need for either the strong hand of the state or the powerful dominant market actors co-opting this innovation in their practices. But I would suggest maybe we need neither. Maybe transitions can be neither state-led nor market-based. And maybe they can be citizen-led and the source, as a result, of greater empowerment and autonomy. And there are many manifestations that you are more familiar with than I am myself of this social diversity at work. And think of it as the equivalent in social life of biodiversity in the natural world. We have community-supported agriculture, we have farmers' markets and short chains, we have community gardens, community kitchens, food commons, as in California, for example. There are many such alternatives building up. the objective of which is certainly not to be co-opted in the dominant system, but to have alternatives proliferate in order to provide real choices to all actors. This is more empowering because it operates bottom-up in local settings rather than it being imposed top-down. It is more subversive because it leads to role shifting and to a more reflexive conception of learning. Let me explain a bit further the distinction between the three transitions. State-led transition, you'll see many of this in my own reports to the UN, because of course I address governments, and so I have to tell them what they need to do, which is to organize a transition. The tools states have are regulation, planning, 5-year, 10-year plans, incentives, taxation, subsidies. And ideally, of course, these tools should be used in participatory processes by being informed by the views of the major stakeholders. And it may lead the government, discussing with NGOs, with social movements, to sometimes improve their policies, what Chris Argyris calls first order or single loop learning. And sometimes it can lead governments to change their values, the very objective that they are pursuing in what Argyris calls second loop or double loop learning. That is a very classic way of understanding transition, and it trusts the state to do this. A second approach is market-led transition. And here the tools are for companies, the big agri-food champions, to adopt new standards, to adopt labels, codes of conduct, to put fair trade products on their shelves, to develop supply chain management schemes in order to ensure that labor rights and environmental constraints are complied with by their suppliers and so forth. And they integrate in a chain-wide approach the concerns for sustainable development in their ways of acting. And sometimes this can also be quite participatory in how it is conceived. For example, in South Africa, they've developed the Food Security Change Lab, which is a round table from the producer to the consumer, including retailers and agri-food processors and so on, discussing how the food chains can be made more sustainable, and this is convened at the initiative of government. In a wide range of cases, we have multi-stakeholder initiatives that support agri-food companies in making these changes, and sometimes the state may itself intervene to support these initiatives by agri-food corporations, for example, by public purchasing policies, by labeling of labels or using false advertising laws to challenge companies to comply with their codes of conduct, or by imposing social and environmental reporting. These transitions are all well known. They are the most classic. They're also the least interesting. A third transition, very interesting to study, but I think it's very interesting to put on the map a third version of transition, which is citizen-led, in which the purpose is not to reform mainstream food systems, but to establish alternative food systems built from the bottom up at the initiative of citizens. And such social diversity should be seen as experimentalist and as encouraging role shifting. It should be seen as experimentalist in that it is a search for alternative solutions in local contexts, opposed to the idea of one knowledge being universally valid in all contexts. And in that respect, the open-ended definition of sustainable development is actually an advantage that allows agnosticism about means how to get there and about the ultimate destination that we are pursuing. Social diversity is, if you wish, ambitious by its very modesty, by not knowing exactly what the destination is, and by recognizing that our ability to know is limited, and that any solution we settle on must be provisional and contextual. And then this social diversity is also encouraging a shifting of roles. And this to me seems perhaps often unnoticed, but quite important. Think of the modernization of the food systems over the past 50, 60 years as one process by which increasingly the various actors have been specializing in various roles and separating functions from one another. In other terms, think of the modernization of the food systems dividing up labor between these different actors. The farmers are passive recipients of technology. They depend on input providers, including seed companies, for their inputs. They receive information from the extension service workers, who themselves depend on the scientists in a very top-down fashion, and the farmers do not control the downstream markets. Consumers are passive buyers. To a large extent, their demand is in fact shaped by supply and advertising. And the relationships between these different actors are linear in the way they are conceived of. They are linked only through price and contracts. Now, there are three impacts to this hyper-specialization in the food chains. A first impact is disempowerment. None of the actors in that kind of chain is in a position that truly allows him or her to change the system. A second impact is de-responsibilization. Each actor may comfortably ignore or minimize the negative side effects of certain development patterns because each actor is, if you wish, a fungible component of a system that has an existence independent from his or her attitude or behavior. And this is, of course, typical of the bureaucratic rationality in which even what looks quite evil from the outsider's perspective is very banal to insiders. And thirdly, third consequence of this hyper-specialization, it is that learning is limited to improving how one acts, single-loop learning, at best to espousing certain new values, double-loop learning, but one's identity, one's role, one's function is never questioned. And this, I think, is a serious handicap to sustainable development because we have a tendency, proven by social psychologists, to repress all the information that disturbs our identities, that truly obliges us to question our behavior, our way of life, and ultimately whom we are. And this is what psychologists call the affluent wild male syndrome. This is very serious. It's actually, this particular piece was based on some 1,800 people being interviewed about their perception of risk. And it was very clear from these interviews that if you receive information that obliges you to question your lifestyle and the privileges you benefit from, you will not process it. You will ignore it. It is indeed an inconvenient truth. And there are many such studies by psychologists that confirm that it's not that we have too little information, it's that we selectively choose to understand or not understand the information that we have access to. Now, in contrast to this hyper-specialization, segmentation, and this linear approach, the emerging alternative food systems result in role shifting. For example, farmers may produce their own inputs or take part in participatory research and control marketing. They may also practice multitasking, diversifying their incomes, climbing up the value chain, directly selling to consumers, marketing their own products, or taking up other activities such as agritourism, for example. And one illustration of this, which I think is very interesting to study, is this development of nested markets documented by Jan Douwe van der Ploeg and others in China, Brazil, and European countries, in which there is a circular relationship between farmers and consumers, in which there are feedback loops organized in the system rather than the system being organized in a linear fashion. Similarly, consumers are producers in CSA schemes, in community gardens, and in the spread of urban and peri-urban agriculture. And indeed, new actors also emerge. For example, in Bangladesh, we have now NGOs such as the BRAC, the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, who provide inputs to farmers, training to farmers, and support agro-processing. Basically, this organization replaces the normal agri-chemical and agri-food companies that otherwise farmers have to depend on. In India, 3 million dairy farmers are linked to one cooperative, Amul, that collects and processes milk and markets dairy products on their behalf. So we move from a linear to a cyclical relationship between these actors in which feedback loops are organized and in which each actor is challenged to change his or her role. However, there are some challenges in this shift and associated with these citizen-led transitions that can build alternative food systems, and perhaps these are some of the questions that could be on the agenda of the research of the Institute for Sustainable Food Systems. Let me list 3 questions. First, how to ensure the coexistence between innovations that result in alternatives to the dominant food regime and this dominant food regime itself. And here there's a balance between 2 potentially competing concerns. One is to preserve the niche experiment, ensuring a certain degree of protection or insulation even, to avoid cooptation, and at the same time ensuring that it can really challenge the mainstream and that it can be an alternative that even the mainstream actors have to consider in order for them to change their practices. In that respect, I would say that the diversity of alternative food systems may be, in some cases, a liability. There are studies showing, based on social movement theory, that whilst the social movement builds its credibility by developing alternatives and giving this movement an empirical knowledge about what it is proposing, at the same time, the more the alternatives are diverse, the less there is a pressure on the system to adopt any single one of these alternatives. And so it may be a problem to have a proliferation of alternatives if the objective is, and that is of course a big if, to put pressure on the dominant food system. That, I think, is a first question we may wish to explore further. A second question is how to promote learning and the diffusion of alternatives and how to ensure, in other terms, their scalability. And here, I would say that one major dilemma is between either building on the preferences of the public, for example, their preference in being independent in their choices, their decision-making, or transforming such preferences, which may be seen as having simply adapted to the choices that the dominant food system have left available to them. Let me take a poll here and ask you the following, and let's see if this is a representative sample of the United States in 2013. Imagine you had a choice in reforming for sustainability the food systems between 3 major alternatives. One is vegetable bag subscription, right? So, in which local producers provide on a regular basis to willing consumers a basket of vegetables. A second is urban gardens. So you have a small parcel of a garden, a vegetable garden to cultivate with your neighbors, and you work on it a few hours per week. And thirdly, there is family takeaway, in which a family prepares food for the neighborhood, and people go at the house and acquire the food from the neighbor family. Now, who would favor the first option? If you had only one vote to cast, who would favor the first option? Vegetable bag subscriptions. Okay, the second option? Slightly more popular, I believe. And the third option? Okay, well, it's relatively evenly divided across you, although the second option was apparently felt to be the most desirable. And it turns out this is roughly what most publics in most countries have chosen. This is actually what was tested by the United Nations Environment Programme in 2011 in a report called Visions for Change that surveyed the expectations of the young population between 18 and 35 years of age concerning sustainability. And they found that in food, but also in mobility and housekeeping, the choices we preferred were choices that were slow, such as urban gardens, that required some investment, but at the same time allowed people to remain independent in making their decisions. Otherwise, people may prefer choices that are relatively quick and easy and comfortable, but they are reluctant to join cooperative mechanisms, such as fetching your food in at the neighbor's place, right? This is not the kind of collectivist solution that people seem to prefer, according to this survey. So the question is, to which extent should this matter if we think of scaling up alternatives to food systems? Should we take these preferences as given, or should we instead try to create, norm bandwagons and changing these preferences as we develop a wider range of alternatives? And then there's a third question I'd like to raise, which is how to connect local experiments to the broader social struggles for food systems that are equitable and sustainable. I think this is a question that is important, but I was surprised to see that none of the definitions of sustainable food systems that I encountered refer explicitly, at least, to the north-south dimension and to the very real impacts that our choices here may have in the global south. And yet, these impacts matter, and they are of concern to large populations in the global south. And of course, the appearance is that it is a paradoxical complaint that is made. On the one hand, farmers in the south complain that their markets are being flooded by OECD-originated foodstuffs, heavily subsidized by taxpayers in OECD countries. Dumping foodstuffs on their markets make it difficult for them to make a decent livelihood. On the other hand, the other complaint is that we capture the resources from the south to serve our own needs, and this is made possible thanks to the vastly superior purchasing power of the populations in the north. Of course, these two complaints are only paradoxical in appearance. The reality is that the two phenomena converge to encourage, in the south, export-led agriculture to satisfy our own needs, yes, but at the expense of the ability for small-scale farmers to make a decent living. And this is why, in large part because of our policies, we've seen this cycle of hunger develop in the global south, the one that has been obsessing me over the past 5 or 6 years, in which small farmers are being displaced because of increased land concentration, competition for resources, and this resulting in their marginalization as all the support goes to agri-export products. This leads to these farmers to migrate to the cities. The cities are overburdened and the slums are swelling in many parts of the developing world. This results in governments being increasingly dependent on importing cheap food from global markets, making it even more difficult for small farmers to make a decent living from their work. And this is the vicious cycle that we have contributed to, and to which food sovereignty is, of course, the answer. Let me conclude. To explain why I chose, as I title, A Tale of Three Transitions, I believe that we should combine in our future work on sustainable food systems a study of social practices, a new understanding of the role of the state, and an agenda for research. We should study innovative social practices that are really an experimental search for sustainable solutions that will lead to a greater diversity in choices offered to producers and consumers alike, and provide especially opportunities for citizen involvement and the role shifting I was describing a few minutes ago. That requires from the state something else than legislating, something else than taxing or subsidizing. It requires from the state that it takes on a facilitator's role, a mediator's role, perhaps simply by removing the obstacles that these social experimenters are experiencing, listening to their complaints, understanding what the difficulties are that they encounter, and working at responding to their demands. It's modest, but vitally important. The state also should create opportunities for new actors to emerge and new coalitions being built, acting as a mediator, for example, between social movements, NGOs, researchers, by creating platforms to make such dialogue possible. And thirdly, the state may sometimes formalize the links between actors by for example, formalizing the agreements between them, creating institutions that allow them to meet on a regular basis, or labeling certain practices that are considered to contribute to sustainable development. And finally, researchers, you and I, we should, I hope, move from purely interdisciplinary to transdisciplinary research with and for social innovators, attentive to what social movements are doing and inventing, and in many cases, they are indeed very inventive. We should develop assessment tools to accelerate collective learning across these variety of experiences. And finally, we should document innovation in order to escape the trap of given expectations, in order to ensure that the preferences are not frozen once and forever, and that instead the range of choices that people understand are open to them is permanently enlarged. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I hope you agree with me that a very thoughtful framing on a set of issues. And the thing that I take away, just in case we had any doubt, is there is plenty of work from all of our perspectives. And I just really want to thank you. Excited for the continuation of this discussion. Now, before we go to our next panel, and take a quick bio break, I would like to ask the panelists for the first panel to come to the stage area so we can set you up. And I'm going to ask the audience to help me welcome Renata Brillinger, our very capable facilitator, helping us facilitate and organizing this work. She is the executive director of the California Climate and Agriculture Network, and she's going to give you some more details about how the day is going to run and what we expect of each other and working together. Thank you, Renata.
Well, thanks. It's just a complete honor and a pleasure to be here today and to have been involved in the launching of this event to date. And thank you all for being part of this. You're essential in this think tank that we're playing in today. So as Maria said, I just wanted to really underscore one of the things she said in her opening remarks, that this is really just the beginning. It's seen very much as the opening volley in a long, multifaceted ping pong ball game, four-dimensional ping pong ball game that we hope you'll all continue to play a part in. So it's going to be ongoing. It's going to be iterative. It's a little mysterious, I think, at this point, exactly where this is going and what the precise process is, but we thank you for your willingness to be guinea pigs in the first step. As the day progresses, the idea is that we'll go from the big picture framing that Olivier presented us with to a little bit more specificity. That's the idea. Now, we have a lot of diverse perspectives deliberately chosen to be in the room and on the panels and among you, so how far we get along that course is unclear, but that's sort of how the panels and the breakout sessions are designed. So that by the end of it, hopefully we're starting to consider some sort of basic questions that might guide a research agenda for this nascent institute. So how is this going to happen? With a lot of participation or cooperation from you all and a lot of moving pieces. We have 2 panel presentations. We'll do one right after the short break that's about to come. We'll have a panel presentation and then breakout group discussions in small groups so that hopefully you get a chance to speak into some of the provocative ideas that are brought forward by the panelists and bring your own experience to the questions. So that's the pattern, basically, a panel, presentation, and then a breakout, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And then we'll conclude with a little sort of impromptu synthesis from 5 people that have graciously volunteered to play the role of listeners through the day. So let me just, there's a number of roles that are being played today. I just want to acknowledge the numerous people who have stepped into leadership roles. There are 4 facilitators that are going to be in each of the 4 small breakout rooms. If you would please stand up. We've got Luke Anderson, Margie Clark, Miriam Villat, and Rose Hayden-Smith. And they're sort of waving. And then in this room, we'll have 9 small breakout tables. The numbers are on various tables, and those are going to be led by volunteer table leaders that are going to sort of help guide the discussion and try to, keep you on time and focused on the questions. Would the 9 of you please stand up? 9 table leaders? Great. Thank you so much for doing that. Those 9, if you would please, right after this, when we go to break, if you would please go to the back of the room and look for Miriam. She's waving her hand. She's going to give you the packets that you need. And then we have 13 volunteer scribes who are going to be trying to record some of the trends and ideas that come up. And they're all students here at UC Berkeley. If the 13 of you would please stand up. Fantastic. That's the least that's the most thankless job and the hardest one, and I wouldn't say it's the most important necessarily, but it's really critical to capturing some of this wisdom and using it as the Institute goes forward, so thanks for doing that. And then there's the 5 people I mentioned earlier playing this role of listener. They're trying to capture to the best of their ability what they're hearing, filtering it through their perspective, some of the key ideas and the trends and the emerging observations, and maybe some of the points of conflict or tension. So that's their primary role. So we've got Professor Maria Echeveste, if you would stand up, Professor Catherine DeMasters, Professor Chris Madsen, Raj Patel, and Professor Ed Daub. So those folks are going to be listening. So if you want to impress upon them a burning point, find them personally and deliver it to them. That would be great. So many thanks to all of those people. Obviously, it takes a village to do something like this. And then where you come in is to try to be as thoughtful, as provocative, as clear, as honest as possible with your thoughts and ideas. And this is a detail, but an essential one. If you could please move smoothly between the transition points. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of moving parts. So I know you want to visit and make your calls and check your emails and stuff, but please try to move as fast as you can from one room to the next or wherever you need to be.